War at home. Covert action against U.S. activists and what we can do about it. Brian Glick. Contents. Introduction 1. A story to learn from. COINTELPRO, Covert action against the domestic dissidents of the 1960s. 7. How we learned about COINTELPRO. 7. How COINTELPRO worked. 9. COINTELPRO's main targets. 10. How COINTELPRO helped destroy the movements of the 1960s. 13. The danger we face. Domestic covert action remains a serious threat today. 19. Domestic covert action did not end in the 1970s. 20. Domestic covert action has persisted throughout the 1980s. 29. Domestic covert action has become a permanent feature of U.S. government. 33. Prospects for the future. What we can do about domestic covert action. Learning the methods of COINTELPRO and how to protect ourselves against them. 1. Infiltration by agents and informers. 2. Psychological warfare from the outside. 3. Harassment through the legal system. 4. Extra-legal force and violence exposing domestic covert action as undemocratic and a form of terrorism. Publicly opposing the government's continued use of domestic covert action. Not letting political repression divert us from building strong movements for social justice. COINTELPRO documents. Notes. Further reading. About the author. Resource organizations. Introduction. In January 1988, the people of the United States learned of a secret nationwide FBI campaign against domestic opponents of U.S. policy in Central America. Government documents obtained through the Freedom of Information Act show that from 1981 through at least 1985, the FBI infiltrated the committee in solidarity with the people of El Salvador and disrupted its work all across the country. The investigation eventually reached into nearly every sector of the anti-intervention movement, from the Maryknoll Sisters, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the New Jewish Agenda to the United Auto Workers, the United Steel Workers, U.S. Senator Christopher Dodd, and U.S. Representatives Pat Schroeder and Jim Wright. Some of the goals and methods of this campaign were revealed by a central participant, Frank Varelli. Varelli admitted that from 1981 through 1984, the FBI paid him to infiltrate and break the Dallas, Texas chapter of CISPs. To this end, he and his cohorts put out bogus literature under the CISPs name, burglarized CISPs members' homes, and paid right-wing students to start fights at CISPs rallies. Varelli was told to seduce an activist nun to get blackmail photos for the FBI. It was also suggested that he plant guns on CISPs members. As part of his work, he routinely exchanged information about U.S. and Central American activists with the Salvadoran National Guard, sponsor of that country's death squads. 2. Elsewhere in the Southwest, in 1984, government informers surfaced as the main witnesses in the federal prosecution of clergy and lay workers providing sanctuary for refugees from El Salvador and Guatemala. Salam 6 Graham and Jesus Cruz testified that they were paid by the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service to infiltrate church services, Bible classes, and sanctuary support networks. They were part of Operation Sojourner, the U.S. Justice Department's countrywide crackdown on sanctuary churches and organizations. In the San Francisco Bay Area, in the early 1980s, the Livermore Action Group's meetings to plan anti-nuclear civil disobedience were similarly infiltrated by both the U.S. Navy and the Federal Emergency Management Administration. 4. The FBI has admitted such operations from 1982 to 84 against the Bay Area branches of Physicians for Social Responsibility and other peace groups. In September 1987, the Bureau fired Special Agent John Ryan for refusing to conduct a similar terrorism investigation of the Illinois peace group, Veterans Fast for Life. 6. In Albany, New York in 1981, the FBI and police infiltrated and disrupted the Capital District Coalition Against Apartheid and Racism. At 3 a.m. on the day of the group's protest against the U.S. tour of the South African Springbok rugby team, FBI agents and state and local police broke into the home of GAR leader Vera Michelson. Supposedly acting on an anonymous FBI informer's false report that the anti-apartheid activists were stockpiling weapons, The officers burst into Michelson's bedroom, put a shotgun to her head, and forced her to crawl to another part of the apartment where she was handcuffed to a table. They then ransacked the apartment, confiscating THIRD files along with private papers and address books. Michelson and 2 other organizers were detained on bogus charges and kept from participating in the demonstration. They later learned that the same FBI infiltrator had spread false reports of planned violence in order to discourage participation in the demonstration. 7 other forms of government harassment hit activists who spent time in Nicaragua or Cuba during the 1980s. Travelers and travel agencies were audited by the Internal Revenue Service. Private papers were copied or confiscated at the border. Mail arrived late and open, or never arrived. Returnees' homes, jobs, churches, and communities were hounded by the FBI. Late world-renowned feminist author Margaret Randall, a former U.S. citizen who returned home after several years in Cuba and Nicaragua, was denied permanent residence status and ordered to leave the United States solely on the basis of the political content of her writings. 9 churches and organizations opposed to U.S. policy in Central America reported more than 300 incidents of harassment from 1984 through 1988, including nearly 100 break-ins. Important papers, files, and computer disks were stolen or found damaged and strewn about, while money and valuables were left untouched. License plates on a car seen fleeing an attempted burglary of the Washington, D.C. Office of Sojourners, a religious group that helped form the Pledge of Resistance to U.S. war in Central America, were traced to the U.S. National Security Agency. Other incidents were also attributed to government agents or to private right-wing groups backed by Lt. Col. Oliver North at the National Security Council. The FBI repeatedly rejected congressional calls for a federal probe. 10 similar break-ins were experienced throughout 1987–88 by U.S. supporters of Palestinian self-determination. On January 26, 1988, the FBI, INS, and Los Angeles police arrested 8 activists for deportation as terrorists. And the evidence against them consisted solely of photos showing that they helped distribute magazines published by the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. As the 8 appealed the INS ruling, their homes were burglarized and boxes of files on their case were stolen from the cars of American Friends Service Committee staff and others active in their defense. Secret INS plans uncovered in February 1988 call for thousands more U.S. Arab American activists to be rounded up and deported as alien terrorists and undesirables. 11. The same terrorist label provided the pretext for recent FBI attacks on the movement for Puerto Rico's independence from U.S. colonial rule. On August 30, 1985, hundreds of FBI agents, backed by military helicopters, rounded up prominent independentistas and charged them with being members of Los Macheros, a clandestine independence organization. The raiders destroyed the editorial offices and printing presses of the progressive journal Pensamiento Critico and ransacked the homes and offices of 38 well-known poets, artists, trade unionists, labor lawyers, and community organizers. 13 were held incommunicado for days and publicly branded as terrorists. Finally charged with conspiracy to rob a Wells Fargo depot in Hartford, Connecticut, 9 were kept in U.S. jails for more than a year, 2 for nearly 3 years, under new federal preventive detention laws. One of those 2, Filiberto Ojeda Rios, who is 55 years old and has a serious heart condition, was released under court order in May 1988 but quickly rejailed and again held without bail. Although the defendants are Spanish-speaking, the court acceded to the prosecution's demand that they be tried in English, more than 1,000 miles from their families and homeland. Pre-trial hearings implicated the FBI in falsified reports, alteration of evidence, burglaries, illegal surveillance, and intimidation of witnesses. 12. A comparable show of paramilitary might accompanied the October 18, 1984 arrest of 8 New York City black activists. A joint anti-terrorist task force of more than 500 FBI and police agents, wielding machine guns and a bazooka, cordoned off entire city blocks to arrest law school graduates, city housing managers, college students, and a union steward. Promising community projects were disrupted while the 8 were held for weeks without bail and placed for almost a year under strict curfew, while their co-workers were jailed for refusing to testify before a grand jury. Acquitted of the major charges when jurors rejected the claims of a police infiltrator, the 8 faced continued police harassment. One was later framed on bogus weapons charges, along with 2 other leaders of a Brooklyn community group, Black Men Against Crack. 13 in Alabama. In the mid-1980s, the FBI mounted an even more massive effort to intimidate grassroots supporters of Jesse Jackson's presidential campaign and to crush the emerging pro-Jackson black leadership based in the Campaign for a New South. Immediately after the September 1984 primaries in Alabama, as many as 200 FBI agents swept through the 5 western Alabama Black Belt counties that had given their votes to Jesse Jackson, rousing elderly people from their beds in the middle of the night, taking about 1,000 of them in police-escorted buses to Mobile to be fingerprinted, and suggesting that their absentee ballots may have been tampered with by the civil rights workers who had secured their votes. The offices of civil rights workers were also raided and some of the documents they needed for the November elections were confiscated. In January 1985, indictments for vote and mail fraud were handed down against 8 of the Black Belt's most experienced organizers and political leaders. In bringing the indictments, the federal government used the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the very act most of these people had marched from Selma to Montgomery to get enacted. 14. Although the defendants were acquitted of all major charges and their organization survived, the raids, interrogations, arrests, and trials took a heavy toll. Government harassment of U.S. political activists clearly exists today, violating our fundamental democratic rights and creating a climate of fear and distrust which undermines our efforts to challenge official policy. Similar attacks on social justice movements came to light during the 1960s. Only years later did we learn that these had been merely the visible tip of an iceberg. Largely hidden at the time was a vast government program to neutralize domestic political opposition through covert action. The 1960s program, coordinated by the FBI under the code name COINTELPRO, was exposed in the 1970s and supposedly stopped. But covert operations against domestic dissidents did not end. They have persisted and become an integral part of government activity. This book is designed to help today's activists learn from the history of COINTELPRO, so that future movements can better fight this war at home. 6. Brian G. LLCK. The opening section reviews what we know about COINTELPRO. It explains how the program was uncovered when the FBI and police were compelled to release previously secret documents. It outlines COINTELPRO's methods and targets and assesses its contribution to the decline of the movements of the 1960s. The next section shows that domestic covert action did not end when COINTELPRO was officially disbanded. It remained in effect under other names and it continues to be a serious threat today. Persisting under Democratic as well as Republican administrations, it has become a permanent feature of U.S. politics. The final section discusses what we can do about this danger. It analyzes the specific methods used in COINTELPRO infiltration, psychological warfare, harassment through the legal system, and extra-legal force and violence and proposes steps to limit or deflect their impact on our movements. It shows that these methods do not protect national security or combat terrorism, as claimed by the government, but actually serve to foment violence and subvert democracy. Various tactics are suggested for publicly exposing the reality of domestic covert action and mobilizing broad-based protest against its continued use. Excerpts from key COINTELPRO documents are reproduced at the back of the book, along with a list of resource groups and additional readings. Domestic covert action is a powerful deterrent to democratic discussion of public policy and effective organizing for social change. We need to take it seriously without being distracted from our main goals. Please talk with other activists about the analysis and recommendations presented here. Adapt the guidelines to the conditions you face. Point out problems and suggest other approaches. Now is the time to begin fighting the hidden war at home. A history to learn from. COINTELPRO. Covert action against the domestic dissidents of the 1960s. While much FBI and police harassment was blatant during the 1960s, and surveillance and infiltration were suspected, talk of CIA-style covert action against domestic dissidents was generally dismissed as paranoia. It was not until the 1970s, after the damage had been done, that the sordid history of COINFELPRO began to emerge. This chapter describes how COINFELPRO was uncovered and what we now know of its methods, targets, and impact. How we learned about COINTELPRO. The first concrete evidence of COINFELPRO surfaced in March 1971, when a citizens' committee to investigate the FBI removed secret files from an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania and released them to the press. 15 That same year, agents began to resign from the Bureau and to blow the whistle on its covert operations. 16 These revelations came at a time of enormous social unrest and declining public confidence in government. Publication of the Pentagon Papers in September 1971 exposed years of systematic official lies about the Vietnam War. Soon it was learned that a clandestine squad of White House plumbers had broken into Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office in an effort to smear the former Pentagon staffer who had leaked the top-secret papers to the press. 17 The same plumbers were caught the following year burglarizing the Watergate offices of the Democratic National Committee. Nationally televised congressional hearings on Watergate revealed a full-blown program of dirty tricks to subvert the anti-war movement as well as the 7. Democratic Party by forging letters, leaking false news items to the press, stealing files, and roughing up demonstrators. Lines of command for these operations were traced to Attorney General Mitchell and the White House, with the FBI implicated in a massive cover-up involving President Nixon and his top staff. By 1971, congressional hearings had already disclosed U.S. Army infiltration of domestic political movements. Similar CIA and local police activity soon came to light, along with ghastly accounts of CIA operations abroad to destabilize democratically elected governments and assassinate heads of state. This crisis was eventually resolved through what historian Howard Zinn describes as a complex process of consolidation, based on the need to satisfy a disillusioned public that the system was criticizing and correcting itself. 18. In this process, the U.S. Freedom of Information Act was amended over President Nixon's veto to provide some degree of genuine public access to FBI documents. Lawsuits under the FOIA forced the Bureau to release some COINTELPRO files to major news media. By 1975, both houses of Congress had launched formal inquiries into government intelligence activities. The agencies under congressional investigation were allowed to withhold most of their files and to edit the Senate committee's reports before publication. 19 The House Committee's report, including an account of FBI and CIA obstruction of its inquiry, was suppressed altogether after part was leaked to the press. 20 Still, pressure to promote the appearance of genuine reform was so great that the FBI had to divulge an unprecedented, detailed account of many of its domestic covert operations. Many important files continue to be withheld, and others have been destroyed. 21 Former operatives report that the most heinous and embarrassing actions were never committed to writing. 22 Officials with #REFNM the 4TYM 41 These attacks, including political assassinations, were so extensive, vicious, and calculated that they can accurately be termed a form of official terrorism. Each of these COINTELPRO methods is described and analyzed in detail on pages 41 to 65. Specific examples from the documentary record of the 1960s are presented there, along with practical suggestions for coping with similar attacks in the future. COINTELPRO's main targets. Though the name COINTELPRO stands for Counterintelligence Program, the government's targets were not enemy spies. The Senate Intelligence Committee later found that under COINTELPRO certain techniques the Bureau had used against hostile foreign agents were adopted for use against perceived domestic threats to the established political and social order. 27. The most intense COINTELPRO operations were directed against the Black movement, particularly the Black Panther Party. This was to some extent a function of the racism of the FBI and police, as well as the vulnerability of the black community. At a deeper level, the choice of targets reflects government and corporate fear of a militant, broad-based black movement. Such a movement is dangerous because of its historic capacity to galvanize widespread rebellion at home and its repercussions for the U.S. image abroad. Moreover, black people's location in major urban centers and primary industries gives them the potential to disrupt the base of the U.S. economy. COINTELPRO's targets were not, however, limited to black militants. Many other activists who wanted to end U.S. intervention abroad or institute racial, gender, and class justice at home also came under attack. Cesar Chavez, Fathers Daniel and Philip Berrigan, Rev. Jesse Jackson, David Dellinger, officials of the American Friends Service Committee and the National Council of Churches, and other leading pacifists were high on the list, as were projects directly protected by the First Amendment, such as anti-war teach-ins, progressive bookstores, independent filmmakers, and alternative newspapers and news services. 28 Martin Luther King, Jr., world-renowned prophet of nonviolence, was the object of sustained FBI assault. King was marked, barely a month before his murder, for elimination as a potential messiah who could unify and electrify the black movement. 29 Ultimately, FBI documents disclosed 6 major official counterintelligence programs. Communist Party USA, this was the first and largest program, which contributed to the party's decline in the late 1950s and was used in the early and mid-1960s mainly against civil rights, civil liberties, and peace activists. Its targets during the latter period included Martin Luther King, Jr., the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, the NAACP, the National Lawyers Guild, the National Committee to Abolish the House Un-American Activities Committee, Women's Strike for Peace, the American Friends Service Committee, and the National Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy. Group seeking independence for Puerto Rico, initially hidden from congressional investigators, and still one of the least well-known, this program functioned to disrupt, discredit, and factionalize the island's main centers of anti-colonial resistance, especially the Puerto Rican Socialist Party and Socialist League. It also appears to have targeted groups fighting for human rights for Puerto Ricans living in the United States, such as the Young Lords Party. Border Coverage Program, this program of covert operations against radical Mexican organizations was similarly concealed from Congress. The few documents released to date do not indicate how much the FBI used it against 1960s Chicano activists such as the Brown Berets, the Crusade for Justice, La Alianza, and the Chicano Moratorium to End the War in Vietnam, which are known to have been infiltrated and repressed by other government agencies. Socialist Workers' Party disruption, in addition to ongoing attacks on the SWP and its youth group, the Young Socialist Alliance, this program operated against whomever those groups supported or worked with, especially Malcolm X and the National Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam. Black nationalist hate groups, this was the vehicle for the Bureau's all-out assault on Martin Luther King, Jr., the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Congress of Racial Equality, the Black Panther Party, the Nation of Islam, the National Welfare Rights Organization, the League of Black Revolutionary Workers, the Dodge Revolutionary Union Movement, the Revolutionary Action Movement, the Republic of New Africa, the Congress of African People, Black student unions, and many local Black churches and community organizations struggling for decent living conditions, justice, equality, and empowerment. New Left, a program to destroy Students for a Democratic Society, the Peace and Freedom Party, the Institute for Policy Studies, and a broad range of anti-war, anti-racist, student, GI, veteran, feminist, lesbian, gay, environmental, Marxist, and anarchist groups, as well as the network of food co-ops, health clinics, child care centers, schools, bookstores, newspapers, community centers, street theaters, rock groups, and communes that formed the infrastructure of the counterculture. White hate groups, this unique program functioned largely as a component of the FBI's operations against the progressive activists who were COINTELPRO's main targets. Under the cover of Being even-handed and going after violent right-wing groups, the FBI actually gave covert aid to the Ku Klux Klan, Minutemen, Nazis, and other racist vigilantes. These groups received substantial funds, information, and protection and suffered only token FBI harassment so long as they directed their violence against COINTELPRO targets. They were not subjected to serious disruption unless they breached this tacit understanding and attacked established business and political leaders. How COINTELPRO helped destroy the movement's of 1960s 30 since COINTELPRO was used mainly against the progressive movements of the 1960s, its impact can be grasped only in the context of the momentous social upheaval which shook the country during those years. All across the United States, black communities came alive with renewed political struggle. Most major cities experienced sustained, disciplined black protest and massive ghetto uprisings. Black activists galvanized multiracial rebellion among GIs, welfare mothers, students, and prisoners. College campuses and high schools erupted in militant protest against the Vietnam War. A predominantly white New Left, inspired by the Black movement, fought for an end to U.S. intervention abroad and a more humane and cooperative way of life at home. By the late 1960s, deep-rooted resistance had revived among Chicanos, Puerto Ricans, Asian Americans, and Native Americans. A second wave of broad-based struggle for women's liberation had also emerged, along with significant efforts by lesbians, gay men, and disabled people. Millions of people in the United States began to reject the dominant ideology and culture. Thousands challenged basic U.S. political and economic institutions. For a brief moment, the crucial mixture of people's confidence in the government and lack of confidence in themselves which allows the government to govern, the ruling class to rule, threatened to break down. 31. By the mid-1970s, this upheaval had largely subsided. Important progressive activity persisted, mainly on a local level, and much continued to be learned and won, but the massive, militant Black and New Left movements were gone. To's sense of infinite possibility and of our collective power to shape the future had been lost. Progressive momentum dissipated. Radicals found themselves on the defensive as right-wing extremists gained major government positions and defined the contours of accepted political debate. Many factors besides COINTELPRO contributed to this change. Important progress was made toward achieving movement goals such as black civil rights, an end to the Vietnam War, and university reform. The mass media, owned by big business and cowed by government and right-wing attack, helped to bury radical activism by ceasing to cover it. Television, popular magazines, and daily papers stereotyped blacks as hardened criminals and welfare chiselers or as the supposedly affluent beneficiaries of reverse discrimination. White youth were portrayed first as hedonistic hippies and mindless terrorists, later as an apolitical, self-indulgent me generation. Both were scapegoated as threats to decent, hard-working middle America. During the severe economic recession of the early to mid-1970s, former student activists began entering the job market, some taking on responsibility for children. Many were scared by brutal government and right-wing attacks culminating in the murder of rank-and-file activists as well as prominent leaders. Some were strung out on the hard drugs that had become increasingly available in Black and Latin communities and among white youth. Others were disillusioned by mistreatment in movements ravaged by the very social sicknesses they sought to eradicate, including racism, sexism, homophobia, class bias and competition. Limited by their upbringing, social position, and isolation from older radical traditions, 196OS activists were unable to make the connections and changes required to build movements strong enough to survive and eventually win structural change in the United States. Middle-class students did not sufficiently ally with working and poor people. Too few white activists accepted third world leadership of multiracial alliances. Too many men refused to practice genuine gender equality. Originally motivated by goals of quick reforms, 196OS activists were ill-prepared for the long-term struggles in which they found themselves. Overly dependent on media-oriented superstars and one-shot dramatic actions, they failed to develop stable organizations, accountable leadership, and strategic perspective. Creatures of the culture they so despised, they often lacked the patience to sustain tedious grassroots work and painstaking analysis of actual social conditions. They found it hard to accept the slow, uneven pace of personal and political change. This combination of circumstances, however, did not by itself guarantee political collapse. The achievements of the 196OS movements could have inspired optimism and provided a sense of the power to win other important struggles. The rightward shift of the major media could have enabled alternative newspapers, magazines, theater, film, and video to attract a broader audience and stable funding. The economic downturn of the early 1970s could have united black militants, new leftists, and workers in common struggle. Police brutality and government collusion in drug trafficking could have been exposed in ways that undermined support for the authorities and broadened the movement's backing. By the close of the decade, many of the movement's internal weaknesses were starting to be addressed. Black-led multiracial alliances, such as Martin Luther King, Jr.'s Poor People's Campaign and the Black Panthers' Rainbow Coalition, were forming. The movement's class base was broadening through black revolutionary unions in auto and other industries, King's increasing focus on economic issues, the New Left spread to community colleges, and the return of working-class GLS radicalized by their experience in Vietnam. At the same time, the women's movement was confronting the deep sexism which permeated 196OS activism, along with its corollaries, homophobia, sexual violence, militarism, competitiveness, and top-down decision-making. While the problems of the 1960s movements were enormous, their strengths might have enabled them to overcome their weaknesses had the upsurge not been stifled before activists could learn from their mistakes. Much of the movement's inability to transcend their initial limitations and overcome adversity can be traced to COINTELPRO. It was through COINTELPRO that the public image of blacks and new leftists was distorted to legitimize their arrest and imprisonment and scapegoat them as the cause of working people's problems. The FBI and police instigated violence and fabricated movement horrors. Dissidents were deliberately criminalized through false charges, frame UPS, and offensive, bogus leaflets and other materials published in their name. COINTELPRO enabled the FBI and police to exacerbate the movement's internal stresses until beleaguered activists turned on one another. Whites were pitted against blacks, blacks against Chicanos and Puerto Ricans, students against workers, workers against people on welfare, men against women, religious activists against atheists, Christians against Jews, Jews against Muslims. Anonymous accusations of infidelity ripped couples apart. Backers of women's and gay liberation were attacked as dykes or faggots. Money was repeatedly stolen and precious equipment sabotaged to intensify pressure and sow suspicion and mistrust. Otherwise manageable disagreements were inflamed by COINTELPRO until they erupted into hostile splits that shattered alliances, tore groups apart, and drove dedicated activists out of the movement. Government documents implicate the FBI and police in the bitter break up of such pivotal groups as the Black Panther Party, SDS, and the Liberation News Service, and in the collapse of repeated efforts to form long-term coalitions across racial, class, and regional lines. While genuine political issues were often involved in these disputes, the outcome could have been different if government agencies had not covertly intervened to subvert compromise and fuel hostility and competition. Finally, it was COINTELPRO that enabled the FBI and police to eliminate the leaders of mass movements without undermining the image of the United States as a democracy, complete with free speech and the rule of law. Charismatic orators and dynamic organizers were covertly attacked and neutralized before their skills could be transferred to others and stable structures established to carry on their work. Malcolm X was killed in a factional dispute which the FBI took credit for having developed in the Nation of Islam. 32 Martin Luther King, Jr. was the target of an elaborate FBI plot to drive him to suicide and replace him in his role of the leadership of the Negro people with conservative black lawyer Samuel Pierce. Many have come to view King's eventual assassination as itself a domestic covert operation. 34 other prominent radicals faced similar attack when they began to develop broad followings and express anti-capitalist ideas. Some were portrayed as crooks, thugs, philanderers, or government agents, while others were physically threatened or assaulted until they abandoned their work. Still others were murdered under phony pretexts, such as shootouts in which the only shots were fired by the police. To help bring down a major target, the FBI often combined these approaches in strategic sequence. Take the case of the Underground Press, a network of some 400 radical weeklies and several national news services, which once boasted a combined readership of close to 30 million. In the late 196 OS, government agents raided the offices of alternative newspapers across the country in purported pursuit of drugs and fugitives. In the process, they destroyed typewriters, cameras, printing presses, layout equipment, business records, and research files, and roughed up and jailed staffers on bogus charges. Meanwhile, the FBI was persuading record companies to withdraw lucrative advertising and arranging for printers, suppliers, and distributors to drop underground press accounts. With their already shaky operations in disarray, the papers and news services were easy targets for a final phase of COINTELPRO disruption. Forged correspondence, anonymous accusations, and infiltrators' manipulation provoked a flurry of wild charges and countercharges that played a major role in bringing many of these promising endeavors to a premature end. 35 A similar pattern can be discerned from the history of the Black Panther Party. Brutal government attacks initially elicited broad support for this new, militant, highly visible national organization and its popular 10-point socialist program for black self-determination. But the FBI's repressive onslaught severely weakened the party, making it vulnerable to sophisticated FBI psychological warfare which so discredited and shattered it that few people today have any notion of the power and potential that the Panthers once represented. 36 What proved most devastating in all of this was the effective manipulation of the victims of COINTELPRO into blaming themselves. Since the FBI and police operated covertly, the horrors they engineered appeared to emanate from within the movements. Activists' trust in one another and in their collective power was subverted, and the hopes of a generation died, leaving a legacy of cynicism and despair which continues to haunt us today. Black Panther Party Program, What We Want, adopted 1966. 1. We want freedom. We want power to determine the destiny of our black community. 2. We want full employment for our people. 3. We want an end to the robbery by the capitalist of our black community. 4. We want decent housing, fit for shelter of human beings. 5. We want education for our people that exposes the true nature of this decadent American society. We want education that teaches us our true history and our role in the present-day society. 6. We want all black men to be exempt from military service. 7. We want an immediate end to police brutality and murder of black people. 8. We want freedom for all black men held in federal, state, county and city prisons and jails. 9. We want all black people when brought to trial to be tried in court by a jury of their peer group or people from their black communities, as defined by the Constitution of the United States. 10. We want land, bread, housing, education, justice and peace. And as our major political objective, a United Nations supervised plebiscite to be held throughout the black colony in which only black colonial subjects will be allowed to participate, for the purpose of determining the will of black people as to their national destiny. Domestic covert action remains a serious threat. Today, the public exposure of COINTELPRO and other government abuses elicited a flurry of apparent reform in the 1970s. President Nixon resigned in the face of impeachment. His Attorney General, other top aides, and many of the plumbers were prosecuted and imprisoned for brief periods. The CIA's director and counterintelligence chief were ousted, and the CIA and the Army were again directed to cease covert operations against domestic targets. 37 The FBI had formally shut down COINTELPRO a few weeks after it was uncovered. As part of the general facelift, the Bureau publicly apologized for COINTELPRO, and municipal governments began to disband the local police red squads that had served as the FBI's main accomplices. A new attorney general notified several hundred activists that they had been victims of COINTELPRO and issued guidelines limiting future operations. Top FBI officials were indicted for ordering the burglary of activists' offices and homes, 2 were convicted, and several others retired or resigned. The Bureau's egomaniacal, crudely racist and sexist founder, Edgar Hoover, died in 1972. After 2 interim directors failed to stem the tide of criticism, a prestigious federal judge, William Webster, was appointed by President Carter to clean house and build a new FBI. 38 Behind this public hoopla, however, the Bureau's war at home continued unabated. Domestic covert action did not end when it was exposed in the 1970s. It has persisted throughout the 1980s and become a permanent feature of U.S. government. 20 Brian GLFCK. Domestic covert action did not end in the 1970s. Director Webster's highly touted reforms did not create a new FBI. They served mainly to modernize the existing bureau and to make it even more dangerous. In place of the backbiting competition with other law enforcement and intelligence agencies which had previously impeded coordination of domestic counterinsurgency, Webster promoted interagency cooperation. Adopting the mantle of an equal opportunity employer, his FBI hired women and people of color to more effectively penetrate a broader range of political targets. By cultivating a low-visibility image and discreetly avoiding public attack on prominent liberals, Webster gradually restored the Bureau's respectability and won over a number of its former critics. 39 state and local police similarly upgraded their repressive capabilities in the 1970s while learning to present a more friendly public face. The Red Squads that had harassed 1960s activists were quietly resurrected under other names. Paramilitary SWAT teams and tactical squads were formed, along with highly politicized community relations and beat rep programs featuring conspicuous Black, Latin, and female officers. Generous federal funding and sophisticated technology became available through the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, while FBI-led Joint Anti-Terrorist Task Forces introduced a new level of interagency coordination. 40 Meanwhile, the CIA continued to use university professors, journalists, labor leaders, publishing houses, cultural organizations, and philanthropic fronts to mold U.S. public opinion. 41 At the same time, ANI special forces and other elite military units began to train local police for counterinsurgency and to intensify their own preparations, following the guidelines of the secret Pentagon contingency plans, Garden Plot and Cable Splicer. They W increasingly on manuals based on the British colonial experience in Kenya and Northern Ireland, which teach the essential methodology of COINTELPRO under the rubric of low-intensity warfare, and stress early intervention to neutralize potential opposition before it can take hold. 42 While domestic covert operations were scaled down once the 196 OS upsurge had subsided, they did not stop. In its April 27, 1971 directives disbanding COINTELPRO, the FBI provided for future covert action to continue with tight procedures to ensure absolute security. And for 3 the results are apparent in the record of 1970s covert operations which have so far come to light. The Native American Movement, 1970s FBI attacks on resurgent Native American resistance have been well documented by Ward Churchill and others. 44 In 1973, the Bureau led a paramilitary invasion of the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota as American Indian Movement activists gathered there for symbolic protests at Wounded Knee, the site of an earlier U.S. massacre of Native Americans. The FBI directed the entire 71-day siege, deploying federal marshals, U.S. Army personnel, Bureau of Indian Affairs police, local goons, and a vast array of heavy weaponry. In the following years, the FBI and its allies waged all-out war on AIM and the native people. From 1973 to 76, they killed 69 residents of the tiny Pine Ridge Reservation, a rate of political murder comparable to the first years of the Pinochet regime in Chile. 45 To justify such a reign of terror and undercut public protest against it, the Bureau launched a complementary program of psychological warfare. Central to this effort was a carefully orchestrated campaign to reinforce the already deeply ingrained myth of the Indian savage. In one operation, the FBI fabricated reports that AIM dog soldiers planned widespread sniping at tourists and burning of farmers in South Dakota. The son of liberal U.S. Senator James Abbe was named as a gun runner, and the Bureau issued a nationwide alert picked up by media across the country. To the same end, FBI undercover operatives framed AIM members Paul Skyhorse Durant and Richard Mohawk Billings for the brutal murder of a Los Angeles taxi driver. A bogus AIM note taking credit for the killing was found pinned to a signpost near the murder site, along with a bundle of hair said to be the victim's scalp. Newspaper headlines screamed of ritual murder by radical Indians. By the time the defendants were finally cleared of the spurious charges, many of AIM's main financial backers had been scared away and its work among a major urban concentration of native people was in ruin. In March 1975, a central perpetrator of this hoax, AIM's National Security Chief Doug Durham, was unmasked as an undercover operative for the FBI. As AIM's liaison with the Wounded Knee Legal Defense/Offense Committee during the trials of Dennis Banks and other Native American leaders, Durham had routinely participated in confidential strategy sessions. He confessed to stealing organizational funds during his 2 years with AIM, and to setting up the arrest of AIM militants for actions he had organized. It was Durham who authored the AIM documents that the FBI consistently cited to demonstrate the group's supposed violent tendencies. Prompted by Durham's revelations, the Senate Intelligence Committee announced on June 23, 1975 that it would hold public hearings on FBI operations against AIM. 3 days later, armed FBI agents assaulted an AIM house on the Pine Ridge Reservation. When the smoke cleared, AIM activist Joe Stuntz kills Wright and 2 FBI agents lay dead. The media, barred from the scene to preserve the evidence, and broadcast the Bureau's false accounts of a bloody Indian ambush, and the congressional hearings were quietly cancelled. The FBI was then free to crush AIM and clear out the last pockets of resistance at Pine Ridge. It launched what the chairman of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission described as a full-scale military-type invasion of the Reservation 46, complete with M-16s, Huey helicopters, tracking dogs, and armored personnel carriers. Eventually AIM leader Leonard Peltier was tried for the agents' deaths before a right-wing judge who met secretly with the FBI. AIM member Anna Mae Aquash was found murdered after FBI agents threatened to kill her unless she helped them to frame Peltier. Peltier's conviction, based on perjured testimony and falsified FBI ballistics evidence, was upheld on appeal. Despite mounting evidence of impropriety in Peltier's trial, and Amnesty International's call for a review of his case, the Native American leader remains in maximum security prison. The Black Movement, government covert action against black activists, also continued in the 1970s. Targets ranged from community-based groups to the Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa and the surviving remnants of the Black Panther Party. In Mississippi, federal and state agents attempted to discredit and disrupt the United League of Marshall County, a broad-based grassroots civil rights group struggling to stop Klan violence. In California, a notorious paid operative for the FBI, Dart Hard Perry, codenamed Othello, infiltrated and disrupted local black groups and took personal credit for the fire that razed the What's Writers Workshop's multi-million-dollar cultural center in Los Angeles in 1973. The Los Angeles Police Department later admitted infiltrating at least 7 1970s community groups, including the Black-led Coalition Against Police Abuse. 47 In the mid-1970s, the U.S. Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms conspired with the Wilmington, North Carolina police to frame 9 local civil rights workers and the Rev. Ben Chavis, field organizer for the Commission for Racial Justice of the United Church of Christ. Chavis had been sent to North Carolina to help black communities respond to escalating racist violence against school desegregation. Instead of arresting Klansmen, the ATP and police coerced 3 young black prisoners into falsely accusing Chavis and the others of burning white-owned property. Although all three prisoners later admitted they had lied in response to official threats and bribes, the FBI found no impropriety. The courts repeatedly refused to reopen the case, and the Wilmington 10 served many years in prison before pressure from international religious and human rights groups won their release. 48 As the Republic of New Africa began to build autonomous black economic and political institutions in the Deep South, the Bureau repeatedly disrupted its meetings and blocked its attempts to buy land. On August 18, 1971, 4 months after the supposed end of COINTELPRO, the FBI and police launched an armed pre-dawn assault on national RNA offices in Jackson, Mississippi. Carrying a warrant for a fugitive who had been brought to RNA headquarters by FBI informer Thomas Spells, the attackers concentrated their fire where the informer's floor plan indicated that RNA President Imari Obadile slept. Though Obadile was away at the time of the raid, the Bureau had him arrested and imprisoned on charges of conspiracy to assault a government agent. 411 The COINTELPRO triggered collapse of the Black Panthers organization, and support in the winter of 1971 left them defenseless as the government moved to prevent them from regrouping. On August 21, 1971, National Party officer George Jackson, world-renowned author of the political autobiography Soledad Brother, was murdered by San Quentin prison authorities on the pretext of an attempted jailbreak. 50 In July 1972, Southern California Panther lead R. Elmer Geronimo Pratt was successfully framed for a senseless $70 robbery murder committed while he was hundreds of miles away in Oakland, California, attending Black Panther meetings for which the FBI managed to lose all of its surveillance records. Documents obtained through the Freedom of Information Act later revealed that at least 2 FBI agents had infiltrated Pratt's defense committee. They also indicated that the state's main witness, Julio Butler, was a paid informer who had worked in the party under the direction of the FBI and the Los Angeles Police Department. For many years, FBI Director Webster publicly denied that Pratt had ever been a COINTELPRO target, despite the documentary proof in his own agency's records. 51 Also targeted well into the 1970s were former Panthers assigned to form an underground to defend against armed government attack on the party. It was they who had regrouped as the Black Liberation Army when the party was destroyed. FBI files show that, within a month of the close of COINTELPRO, further Bureau operations against the BLA were mapped out in secret meetings convened by presidential aide John Ehrlichman and attended by President Nixon and Attorney General Mitchell. In the following years, many former Panther leaders were murdered by the police in supposed shootouts with the BLA. Others, such as Sundiata Acoli, Assata Shakur, Doraba al-Mujahid bin Wahad, and the New York Three were sentenced to long prison terms after rigged trials. 52 In the case of the New York Three, FBI ballistics reports withheld during their mid-1970s trials show that bullets from an alleged murder weapon did not match those found at the site of the killings, for which they are still serving life terms. The star witness against them has publicly recanted his testimony, swearing that he lied after being tortured by police and secretly threatened by the prosecutor and judge. The same judge later dismissed petitions to reopen the case, refusing to hold any hearing or to disqualify himself, even though his misconduct is a major issue. As the New York Three continued to press for a new trial, their evidence was ignored by the news media while their former prosecutors' one-sided, racist docudrama on the case, Badge of the Assassin, aired on national television. The Chicano and Puerto Rican movements, from 1972 to 1974, La Raza Unida Party of Texas was plagued with repeated, unsolved COINTELPRO-style political break-ins. 54 Former government operative Eustacia Frank Martinez has admitted that after the close of COINTELPRO, the U.S. Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms paid him to help destroy La Casa de Carnalísimo, a Chicano community anti-drug program in Los Angeles. Martinez, who had previously infiltrated the Brown Berets and the Chicano Moratorium, stated that the ATF directed him to provoke bombings and plant a drug pusher in La Casa. 55 In 1973, Chicano activist and lawyer Francisco Kiko Martinez was indicted in Colorado on trumped-up bombing charges and suspended from the bar. he was forced to leave the United States for fear of assassination by police directed to shoot him on sight. When Martinez was eventually brought to trial in the 1980s, many of the charges against him were dropped for insufficient evidence and local juries acquitted him of others. One case ended in a mistrial when it was found that the judge had met secretly with prosecutors, police, and government witnesses to plan perjured testimony, and had conspired with the FBI to conceal video cameras in the courtroom. 56. Starting in 1976, the FBI manipulated the grand jury process to assault both the Chicano and Puerto Rican movements. Under the guise of investigating Las Fuerzas Armadas de Liberación Nacional Puerto Rico and other Puerto Rican urban guerrillas, the Bureau harassed and disrupted a cultural center, an alternative high school, and other promising community organizing efforts in Chicago's Puerto Rican barrio and in the Chicano communities of Denver and northern New Mexico. It subpoenaed radical Puerto Rican trade union leader Federico Cintrón Fialo and key staff of the National Commission on Hispanic Affairs of the U.S. Episcopal Church to appear before federal grand juries and jailed them for refusing to cooperate. The independent labor movement in Puerto Rico and the Commission's important work in support of Puerto Rican and Chicano organizing were effectively discredited. 57. On July 25, 1978, an undercover agent lured two young Puerto Rican independence activists, Carlos Soto Arrivi and Arnaldo Dario Rosado, to their deaths in a police ambush at Cerro Maravilla, Puerto Rico. The agent, Alejandro González Malavi, worked under the direct supervision of the FBI-trained intelligence chief of the island's police force. The FBI refused to investigate when the police claimed they were merely returning gunfire initiated by the activists. Later it was proved that Soto and Dario had surrendered and were then beaten and shot dead while on their knees. Though a number of officers were found guilty of perjury in the cover-up and one was sentenced for the murder, the officials who set up the operation remain free. Gonzalez has been promoted. SS on November 11, 1979, Angel Rodriguez Cristobal, popular socialist leader of the movement to stop U.S. Navy bombing practice on the inhabited Puerto Rican island of Vieques, was murdered in the U.S. penitentiary in Tallahassee, Florida. Though U.S. authorities claimed suicide, Rodriguez Cristobal, in the second month of a 6-month term for civil disobedience, had been in good spirits when seen by his lawyer hours before his death. He had been subjected to continuous threats and harassment, including forced drugging and isolation, during his confinement. Though he was said to have been found hanging by a bed sheet, there was a large gash on his forehead and blood on the floor of his cell. 59. The women's, gay, and lesbian movements. FBI documents show that the women's liberation movement remained a major target of covert operations throughout the 1970s. Long after the official end of COINTELPRO, the Bureau continued to infiltrate and disrupt feminist organizations, publications, and projects. Its view of the women's movement is revealed by a 1973 report listing the National Women's Newspaper off our backs as armed and dangerous extremists. N60 covert operations also continued against lesbian and gay organizing. One former FBI informer, Earl Robert Buchenmerod, revealed that from October 1971 through June 1972 he received a weekly stipend to infiltrate gay publications and organizations in the District of Columbia. He was ordered to conduct break-ins, spread false rumors that certain gay activists were actually police or FBI informants, and create racial dissension between and within groups. One assignment involved calling black groups to tell them they would not be welcome at Gay Activists Alliance and Gay Liberation Front meetings. 61. As in the case of the Puerto Rican and Chicano movements, criminal investigations provided a convenient pretext for escalated FBI attacks on lesbian and feminist activists in the mid-1970s. In purported pursuit of anti-war fugitive Susan Sachs and Kathy Powers, FBI agents flooded the women's communities of Boston, Philadelphia, Lexington, Hartford, and New Haven. Their conspicuous interrogation of hundreds of politically active women, followed by highly publicized grand jury subpoenas and jailings, wreaked havoc in health collectives and other vital projects. Activists and potential supporters were scared off, and fear spread across the country, hampering women's and lesbian organizing nationally. 62. The anti-war and New Left movements. Government covert action against the New Left and anti-war movements also persisted, especially as activists mobilized to protest the 1972 Republican and Democratic Party conventions. In San Diego, where the Republicans initially planned to convene, this campaign culminated in the January 6, 1972 attempt on the life of anti-convention organizer Peter Boehmer by a secret army organization of ex-Minutemen formed, subsidized, armed, and protected by the FBI. 63. Movement organizing and government sabotage continued when the Republican convention was moved to Miami Beach, Florida. In May 1972, Bill Lemmer, Southern Regional Coordinator of Vietnam Veterans Against the War, a key group in the convention protest coalition, surfaced as an undercover FBI operative. Lemmer's false testimony enabled the Bureau to haul the VOB's national leadership before a grand jury hundreds of miles away during the week of the convention. 64. FBI efforts to put the WAW out of business and were later confirmed by another ex-operative. Joe Burton of Tampa, Florida, told the New York Times that between 1972 and 1974 he worked as a paid FBI operative assigned to infiltrate and disrupt various radical groups in this country and Canada. And Burton described how specialists were flown in from FBI headquarters to help him forge bogus documents and establish a sham political group, the Red Star Cotter, for disruptive purposes. And 65. The same article reported that two other former FBI operatives, Harry E. Schaefer, 3D, and his wife, Jill, told of similar disruptive activity they undertook at the Bureau's direction during the same period. Working out of a similar bogus New Orleans front group, termed the Red Collective, the Schaefers boasted of diverting substantial funds which had been raised to support the American Indian movement. The labor movement, one of agent provocateur Joe Burton's main targets, was the United Electrical Workers Union. The FBI falsified records to get Burton into UE Tampa Local 1201 soon after its successful 1973 organizing drive upset the Westinghouse Corporation's plan to develop a chain of non-union plants in the South. Burton's attacks on genuine activists repeatedly disrupted UE meetings. His ultra-left proclamations in the union's name antagonized newly organized workers and gave credibility to the company's red baiting. Burton also helped the FBI move against the United Farm Workers and the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. 66. In the mid-1970s, the FBI was instrumental in covering up the murder of labor activist Karen Silkwood and the theft of her files documenting the radioactive contamination of workers at the Kerr-McGee nuclear fuel plant near Oklahoma City. Silkwood, elected to the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Local Bargaining Committee, had amassed proof that the company was falsifying safety reports to hide widespread exposure to dangerous levels of highly carcinogenic plutonium. She was killed when her car crashed into a concrete embankment en route to a November 13, 1974 meeting with New York Times reporter David Burnham. Her files were never recovered from the wreck. While prominent independent experts concluded that Silkwood's car was bumped from behind and forced off the road, the FBI found that she fell asleep at the wheel after overdosing on Quaaludes and that she never had any files. It quickly closed the case, and helped Kerr-McGee sabotage congressional investigations and posthumously slander Silkwood as a mentally unstable drug addict. Key to the smear campaign were articles and testimony by Jacques Ruggie, a Tennessee journalist secretly in the employ of the FBI, who later confessed to having served in a long string of 1960s COINTELPRO operations. 67. In 1979, government operatives played key roles in the massacre of communist labor organizers during a multiracial anti-Klan march in Greensboro, North Carolina. Heading the KKK/Nazi death squad was Ed Dawson, a longtime paid FBI/police informer in the Klan. Leading the local American Nazi Party branch into Dawson's United Racist Front was U.S. Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms undercover agent Bernard Butkavish. Though their controlling agencies were fully warned of the front's murderous plans, they did nothing to protect the demonstrators. Instead, the police gave Dawson a copy of the march route and withdrew as his caravan moved in for the kill. Dawson's sharpshooters carefully picked off key cadre of the Communist Workers' Party, including the president and president-elect of two amalgamated clothing and textile workers' union locals, an organizer at a third local mill, and a leader of AFSCME's organizing drive at a nearby medical center. In the aftermath, the FBI attempted to cover up the government's role and to put the blame on the CWP. 68 At the turn of the decade, the Bureau joined with Naval Intelligence and the San Diego Police to neutralize a militant multiracial union at the shipyards of the National Steel and Shipbuilding Company, a major U.S. naval contractor. The Bureau paid Ramon Barton to infiltrate Iron Workers Local 627 when it elected leftist officers and began to publicly protest dangerous working conditions. After an explosion from a gas leak killed 2 workers, Barton lured 3 others into helping him build a bomb and transport it in his van, where they were arrested. Though the workers entrapped by Barton were not union officials and were acquitted of most charges by a San Diego jury, the Iron Workers International used their trial as a pretext for placing the local in trusteeship and expelling its elected officers. 69. Domestic covert action has persisted throughout the 1980s. All this and more occurred during a period of liberal reform, when political activism had somewhat subsided. The 1980s, by contrast, have been marked by the rise of right-wing political power and new forms of popular opposition to reactionary government policy. Under these conditions, the danger of domestic covert action is greater than ever. One indication of the severity of the current threat is the level of recent political repression. The incidents reviewed in the introduction are marked by the kind of blatant harassment that was consistently used in conjunction with COINTELPRO, offices of churches and groups opposing U.S. Central America policy conspicuously burglarized, personal papers of international travelers confiscated by U.S. Customs upon their return at the border, dissidents facing deportation for their political views, activists hounded at their jobs and in their communities, hauled before grand juries, and arrested and jailed on false charges. Even more alarming is the amount of current covert activity that has come to light. Since the V.LST majority of COINTELPRO type operations stay hidden until long after the damage has been done, those we are already aware of represent only the tip of the iceberg. Far more is sure to lurk beneath the surface. Most of today's domestic covert action can be kept concealed because full government secrecy has been restored. The Freedom of Information Act, a source of major disclosures about COINTELPRO, was drastically narrowed in the 1980s through administrative and judicial reinterpretation as well as legislative amendment. Thousands of government files were shielded from public scrutiny under presidential directives that vastly expand the range of information classified top secret. Government employees now face censorship even after they retire, and new laws make it a federal crime to disclose any information that identifies an individual as a covert agent. 70. While restoring full secrecy, the Reagan administration invested covert action with a new legitimacy. In the past, such operations were acknowledged to be improper and illegal. The Senate Intelligence Committee condemned COINTELPRO as a sophisticated vigilante operation aimed squarely at preventing the exercise of First Amendment rights of speech and association. 71. From its inception, the CIA was barred by law from performing internal security functions and top government officials took care to insulate themselves so they could deny involvement if an unseemly operation came to light. These conditions established a kind of speed limit, a set of restrictions which the agencies felt free to exceed, but only by a certain margin. In the 1980s even the ceiling was lifted. Reagan and his cohorts openly embraced the use of covert operations at home and abroad. They endorsed such action, legalized it, sponsored it, and raised it to the level of patriotic virtue. Within months of taking office, Reagan pardoned W. Mark Felt and Edward S. Miller, the only FBI officials convicted of COINTELPRO crimes. His congressional allies publicly honored these criminals and praised their work. 73. The president continually revived the tired old Red Scare, adding a new terrorist bogeyman, while Attorney General Meese campaigned to narrow the scope of the Bill of Rights and limit judicial review of the constitutionality of government action. From the National Security Council's offices in the White House basement, Lt. Col. Oliver North proudly funded and orchestrated break-ins and other dirty tricks to defeat congressional critics of U.S. policy in Central America and neutralize grassroots protest. He ran elaborate networks of paper organizations set up by former government Covert operatives who regrouped to do the same work for more money in the private sector. And Special Prosecutor Walsh found evidence that North and retired Air Force Gen. Richard Secord used Iran-Contra funds to harass the Christie Institute, a church-funded public interest law group which specializes in exposing government misconduct. 74 North also helped Reagan's cronies at the Federal Emergency Management Administration develop contingency plans for suspending the Constitution, establishing martial law, and holding political dissidents in concentration camps in the event of national opposition against a U.S. military invasion abroad. 75. Much of what was done outside the law under COINFELPRO has since been legalized by Executive Order No. 12333 and new Attorney General's Guidelines on General Crimes, Racketeering Enterprise, and Domestic Security/Terrorism Investigations. For the first time in U.S. history, government infiltration for the purpose of influencing the activity of domestic political organizations has received official sanction. This prerogative is now extended to the FBI and anyone acting on its behalf. It provided a legal pretext for the Bureau's attacks on CISPs and other opponents of U.S. policy in Central America. The new executive order asserts the President's right to authorize CIA special activities and redefined to include activity anywhere in support of national foreign policy objectives abroad. 3.4. It legalizes counterintelligence activities within the United States and on the part of the FBI and the CIA, Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines. 1.12. Specialized equipment, technical knowledge, or assistance of expert personnel may be provided by any of these agencies to support local law enforcement. All are free to mount electronic and mail surveillance without a warrant, and the FBI may also conduct warrantless unconsented physical searches if the Attorney General finds probable cause to believe the action is directed against a foreign power or an agent of a foreign power. This signals open season on CISPs, sanctuary churches, anti-apartheid groups, and anyone else who maintains friendly relations with a country or movement opposed by the administration or who dares to organize protest against U.S. foreign policy. Given how much is at stake, we can hardly afford to ignore these many signs of danger. The FBI and police have now been fully rehabilitated. The CIA and military have assumed an expanded home front role. Covert action has been legalized and endorsed at the highest levels of government. Official secrecy has been restored. Government harassment of domestic dissidents continues unabated. Evidence of current infiltration and clandestine disruption is surfacing at an alarming rate. Taken together, these developments leave us only one safe assumption: full-scale covert operations are already underway to neutralize today's opposition movements before they can reach the massive level of the 1960s. Domestic covert action has become a permanent feature of U.S. government so long as conservative Republicans remain in power. There is no reason to expect this threat to subside. But what if liberal Democrats were in control? Recent U.S. history indicates that so far as covert operations are concerned, the difference would be marginal at best. The record of the past years reveals a pattern of continuous domestic covert action. Its use has been documented in each of the last 9 administrations, Democratic as well as Republican. FBI testimony shows COINTELPRO tactics already in full swing during the presidencies of Democrats Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Harry Truman. 76 COINTELPRO itself, while initiated under Eisenhower, grew from 1 program to 6 under the Democratic administrations of Kennedy and Johnson. It flourished when an outspoken liberal, Ramsey Clark, was Attorney General. After COINTELPRO was exposed, similar programs continued under other names during the Carter years as well as under Nixon, Ford, and Reagan. They have outlived J. Edgar Hoover and remained in place under all of his successors. Covert police methods have been used against progressive social movements since the founding of the country. Undercover operatives disrupted the historic efforts of rebel slaves and Native American, Mexican, and Puerto Rican resistance. Dissident journalists, insurgent workers, and rebellious farmers were arrested on false charges and jailed or hung after rigged trials. 77 Through most of U.S. history, progressive activists faced the blatant brutality of hired thugs and right-wing vigilantes backed by government troops. As the country grew more urban and industrial, newly formed municipal police forces came to play a greater role. By the turn of the century, local police departments were running massive anti-union operations in collaboration with the Pinkertons and other private detective agencies. 78 With World War I and the increasing national integration of the U.S. political economy, the federal government began to take more responsibility for control of domestic dissent. From 1917 on, the Justice Department's Bureau of Investigation, forerunner of the FBI, coordinated its work closely with a 250,000-member right-wing vigilante group, the American Protective League. Together they mounted nationwide raids, arrests, and prosecutions which jailed thousands of draft resistors and labor activists and destroyed the industrial workers of the world. 79 Following the Russian Revolution, the Bureau helped foment the Red Scare of 1919-20. J. Edgar Hoover took personal responsibility for deporting Red Emma Goldman and directing the Palmer raids in which thousands of progressive immigrants were rounded up, jailed, and brutalized, and hundreds were deported. 80 Stung by public criticism of these raids, Hoover switched to more covert methods in the early 1920s. His men infiltrated the ranks of striking railway workers and penetrated the Sacco Vanzetti Defense Committee to steal funds raised to support the indicted anarchists. 81 In an operation that prefigured COINTELPRO, Hoover masterminded the destruction of the main black movement of the post-World War I period, Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. His agents penetrated the multi-million-member UNIA and set up the federal mail fraud conviction that discredited its charismatic leader, leading to Garvey's deportation and the group's collapse. 82 Through the rest of the 1920s, the Bureau kept a low profile as domestic insurgency subsided. In the early years of the Depression, primary responsibility for policing dissent remained in the hands of local law enforcement agencies, private detectives, and right-wing groups such as the American Legion. Meanwhile, Hoover and the FBI rose to national prominence by leading a widely heralded war on crime. Their capture of John Dillinger and other notorious desperados made headlines across the country. The Bureau was glorified in Hollywood films and an immensely popular radio series. The media portrayed the FBI as invincible and proclaimed Edgar Hoover Public Hero Number 1. This new stature positioned the Bureau to regain its status as the nation's political police. In 1936, it won secret authorization to once again target subversive activities in the United States. In a memo to his subordinates, Hoover attributed this coup to confidential information he had presented to President Roosevelt showing that the Communists practically controlled at least one key industrial union and were moving to get control of others. 84 The FBI vastly expanded its operations during World War II and acquired new covert technology, including the capacity for expert forgery. In the aftermath of the war, as the United States began to exercise hegemonic world power and to identify the Soviet Union as its main enemy, the Bureau firmly established its political role as an accepted institutional reality. The Senate Intelligence Committee later found that it was in this period, well before the start of COINTELPRO, that the domestic intelligence programs of the FBI became permanent features of government, as the committee attributes the Bureau's ability to consolidate political police powers to the Cold War fears which swept the country during the late 1940s and the 1950s, but it skips over the Bureau's central role in fomenting those fears. FBI Director Hoover openly threw his enormous public prestige behind the post-war witch hunts mounted by the House Un-American Activities Committee and Joseph McCarthy's Senate Internal Security Subcommittee. Directed by law to investigate the loyalty of federal employees, the FBI secretly passed confidential raw files to its congressional allies, especially McCarthy and the rising young star of HUAC, Richard Nixon. 86 Above all, Hoover and his men set up and orchestrated the pivotal spy trials that made the witch hunts credible. In 1950, former high-ranking State Department official Alger Hiss, president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, was found guilty of perjury for denying that he had copied confidential government papers for the Soviet Union in the late 1930s. In 1951, U.S. Communists Ethel and Julius Rosenberg and Morton Sobel were convicted, and the Rosenbergs executed, for allegedly passing to the Soviet Union atomic secrets that were already general scientific knowledge. In each case, the star witness was an informer whose initial contradictory accounts were meshed into semi-coherent testimony only after months of careful FBI coaching. In each, the supposedly incorruptible FBI vouched for the authenticity of key documentary evidence which activists later learned could easily have been forged. 87 Subsequent investigation and analysis suggest that both cases may well have been fabricated. At the time, however, their impact was devastating. By appearing to validate the witch hunts, they paved the way for the purge of an entire generation of radicals from U.S. political and cultural life. In this atmosphere of anti-communist hysteria, as in the preceding years of wartime fear of espionage, the FBI was free to move against a broad range of domestic political movements. It took an occasional swipe at the right wing and managed to arrest a few outright Nazi saboteurs. As always, however, the brunt of its attack was directed against those who sought progressive social change. The Senate Intelligence Committee documented long-standing, pre-Cohen-Fel pro-FBI infiltration of industrial unions, major black organizations, the unemployed movement, the Nationalist Party of Puerto Rico, and at least one group of Reform Democrats. 88 documents later obtained under the Freedom of Information Act reveal FBI undercover operations in the late 1940s against the third-party presidential candidacy of former Vice President Henry Wallace, the pro-Wallace American Labor Party, and U.S. Congressman Vito Marcantonio. 89 other Bureau memoranda show the collaboration of Ronald Reagan, confidential informant T10, in FBI maneuvers to oust leftists from the Screen Actors Guild and the Hollywood film industry. 90 Bureau targets during the late 1940s and early 1950s also included the National Lawyers Guild and the American Friends Service Committee, as well as the Mattachine Society, the Daughters of Bilitis, and other early gay and lesbian rights groups. 91 From the outset, these groups faced far more than mere surveillance. From 1936 to 56, the FBI took advantage of wartime fears and post-war hysteria to slip into place the domestic covert operations later consolidated under COINTELPRO. Ex-agents report that activists' homes and offices were routinely burglarized during these years. 92 As early as 1939, the Bureau began to compile a secret security index listing subversives to be detained in the event of a national emergency. William Sullivan, former head of the FBI Intelligence Division, testified that, "We were engaged in COINTELPRO tactics, to divide, confuse, weaken, in diverse ways, an organization. We were engaged in that when I entered the Bureau in 1941. 1094 The Senate Intelligence Committee found that by 1946 the Bureau had a policy of preparing and disseminating propaganda to discredit its targets. 95 Thus, COINTELPRO was not a radical departure. It merely centralized and intensified long-standing FBI policy and practice. The 1956 directive setting up the new program took as its starting point the historic record of Bureau work to foster factionalism, bring the Communist Party and its leaders into disrepute before the American public, and cause confusion and dissatisfaction among rank-and-file members. It called for a better coordinated, more focused, all-out disruptive attack to make up for new judicial restrictions on political prosecutions and to eliminate once and for all a U.S. left already in disarray. 16 Conceived as a mid-1950s coup de grace against a failing old left, COINTELPRO became the cutting edge of the Bureau's attack on the rising struggles of the 1960s. It provided the framework for operations against the resurgent black movement whose first audible rumblings, in the 1955 Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott, may explain the urgency of the Bureau's drive to do away with what remained of an organized radical presence in the United States. It also formed the FBI's primary response to the student and anti-war protests which swept the country during the 1960s. COINTELPRO grew increasingly important as the traditional modes of repression failed. An undaunted new generation of activists made a laughingstock of HUAC and turned criminal trials into political forums. Although brute force ultimately did contribute to their demise, for most of the decade police beatings served only to stiffen resistance and to help win over the millions who watched on television. Reviewing the Bureau's experience with domestic covert action as of 1964, J. Edgar Hoover concluded that these ideas will not be increased in number or improved upon from the standpoint of accomplishments merely through the institution of a program such as COINTELPRO, which is given another name, and which, in fact, only encompasses everything that has been done in the past or will be done in the future. 97. True to his words, Hoover did continue domestic covert action under another name when he eventually had to shut down COINTELPRO. Fearing public exposure, the FBI reverted to the less centralized, more secure procedures of the previous era, but the basic approach persisted. Over the past 50 years, clandestine work has become an essential part of the Bureau's mode of operation. Many of its senior agents are now specialists whose professional advancement requires that the government continue to rely on covert action. A similar group of old hands has emerged from the covert operations that the United States and its European allies developed in an effort to maintain control of their colonies and ne-colonies in countries such as Algeria, the Congo, India, Northern Ireland, Chile, and Vietnam. With Hoover's death and Webster's ascendancy at the FBI and then the CIA, the two sets of spies came gradually to coordinate and integrate their work. The combined experience of these veteran covert operatives has given rise to a growing literature and theory of counterinsurgency. Their widely circulated texts and manuals restate the basic precepts of COINTELPRO and pound home the necessity for continuous covert operations. The leading treatise, Low-Intensity Operations, Subversion, Insurgency, and Peacekeeping, by Frank Kitson, British commander in Kenya, Malaysia, Cyprus, and Northern Ireland, insists that infiltration and psychological operations be mounted against dissident groups in normal times before any mass movement can develop. 18 Careerism, Old Boy networks, theories, and treatises help to perpetuate domestic covert action. The persistence of such operations can be fully explained, however, only in terms of their value to economic and political elites. Any social order based on inequality of wealth and power depends, to some degree, on political repression to control the disadvantaged majority. Modem U.S. elites have particular need for covert measures because the war at home is primarily the responsibility of the federal government, a government which is under intense pressure to appear to be democratic. The federal government has become the main arm of domestic repression through a series of historic developments. First, internal political conflict has come to focus increasingly on issues of public policy. Second, business and industry, which once played a major role, now rely on the public sector for unprofitable support. See vices from post offices, airports, roads, and job training to the pacification of workers and markets at home and abroad. They are no longer willing to maintain a large-scale in-house apparatus for repressing societal political dissent or to purchase such services from private agencies. Finally, state and local governments lack the funds and personnel to cope with countrywide dissident movements. Federal coordination and direction is demanded by the national integration of the U.S. economy and culture, with its geographically mobile population and instant communication. For all these reasons, U.S. domestic political repression is now effectively nationalized. Local police may still be the foot soldiers for many arrests, raids, beatings, and infiltrations. College administrators, corporate security forces, and private right-wing groups may also help out. But when it comes to full-scale strategic, coordinated domestic counterinsurgency, only the feds can do the job. But the federal government has other imperatives. It strives to maintain U.S. control over world markets and resources in an era when most of Asia, Africa, and Latin America have been legally decolonized. It competes internationally with the Soviet Union, Germany, and Japan. At the same time, it needs patriotic support, or at least passive acquiescence, at home. For all these purposes, it must effectively promote the image of the United States as leader of the free world, complete with free speech and the rule of law. If the U.S. government is seen as unduly repressive within its own borders, however, it will have trouble maintaining the allegiance of its citizenry and competing effectively for world influence. It can sustain its legitimacy, while effectively marginalizing or eliminating domestic dissent, if it makes the victims of official violence appear to be the aggressors and provokes dissident movements to tear themselves apart through factionalism and other modes of self-destruction. No wonder covert action is here to stay. Prospects for the future. What we can do about domestic covert action. We obviously cannot stop domestic covert action simply by electing better public officials, passing stronger laws, or winning court cases. Clandestine repression will end only with the elimination of the race, gender, class, and international domination it serves to uphold. Meanwhile, it severely undermines our ability to build the broad-based movements needed to win fundamental change. To organize and sustain such movements, we have to learn how to deal with domestic covert action in a way that minimizes its interference with our work. There are two complementary means to this end. The first approach requires work within our movements. It is essential that we learn to recognize the methods of covert action and take steps to reduce their impact on our work. The second approach involves organizing publicly to expose and oppose the government's continued reliance on those methods. Though domestic covert action cannot be eliminated without more systemic change, we do have the capacity to substantially limit and weaken it. Learning the methods of COINTELPRO and how to protect ourselves against them, though the details of future covert action will be adapted to changing social and technological conditions, only a limited number of basic methods and approaches exist. Like chess masters and military strategists who hone their skills by replaying old contests, we can improve our ability to defend against these modes of attack through close study of recent history. If we understand how the FBI and police moved in the past, we will be better able to recognize and avoid their future tricks and traps. If we grasp the mistakes of earlier movements, we can take essential precautions now without encouraging paranoia or diverting attention from our main goals. 39. A checklist of essential precautions. 1. Check out the authenticity of any disturbing letter, rumor, phone call, or other communication before acting on it. Ask the supposed source if she or he is responsible. 2. Keep records of incidents which appear to reflect COINTELPRO-type activity. Evaluate your response and report your experiences to the Movement Support Network and other groups that document repression and resistance around the country. 3. Deal openly and honestly with the differences within our movements before the FBI and police can exploit them. 4. Don't try to expose a suspected agent or informer without solid proof. Purges based on mere suspicion only help the FBI and police create distrust and paranoia. It generally works better to criticize what a disruptive person says and does, without speculating as to why. 5. Support all movement activists who come under government attack. Don't be put off by political slander, such as recent attempts to smear some militant opponents of government policy as terrorists. Organize public opposition to all FBI witch hunts, grand jury subpoenas, political trials, and other forms of government and right-wing harassment. 6. Cultivate relationships with sympathetic journalists who seem willing to investigate and publicize domestic covert operations. Let them know when you are harassed. Since the FBI and police thrive on secrecy, public exposure can undermine their ability to subvert our work. 7. Don't try to tough it out alone. Don't let others fret and suffer by themselves. Make sure that activists who are under extreme stress get the help they need. It is crucial that we build support networks and take care of one another. 8. Above all, do not let our movements be diverted from their main goals. Our most powerful weapon against political repression is effective organizing around the needs and issues which directly affect people's lives. The specific methods of covert action which we know the FBI and police used in the 1960s are described below, under the categories of infiltration by agents and informers, psychological warfare from the outside, harassment through the legal system, and extra-legal force and violence. The following recommendations for protecting against each type of attack are meant to provide starting points for discussion. They are based on the author's 25 years of experience as an activist and lawyer, and on talks with longtime organizers from a broad range of movements. By adapting these guidelines to particular conditions. 41. And experimenting with new approaches, we can determine together how best to protect our movements and ourselves. 1. Infiltration by agents and informers. Infiltrators are agents or enforcement officers disguised as activists, or informers who work in a movement or community under the direction of a law enforcement or intelligence agency. Informers may be recruited from within a group or sent in by an agency, or they may be disaffected former members or supporters. They are generally untrained and hard for the agency to control. In the past, the FBI had to rely mainly on informers or local police infiltrators because it had very few black, Latin, or female agents, and its strict dress and grooming code left white male agents unable to look like activists. As a modem equal opportunity employer, today's FBI has fewer such limitations, along with a whispering campaign, and to tag Carmichael with a CIA label. NI-07. The modem method proved especially effective against a top national official of the Communist Party USA, William Albertson. In 1964, the Bureau simulated Albertson's handwriting and prepared a bogus informer's report from him to his supposed controlling agent. An FBI infiltrator then planted the bogus report in a car in which Albertson had recently been a passenger. When experts insisted that the writing was his, Albertson was expelled from the party in disgrace. 108. 44. Brian Glick. Guidelines for coping with infiltration. 1. Be careful to avoid pushing a new or hesitant member, or one facing personal, financial, or legal problems, to take risks beyond what that person is ready to handle, particularly in situations which could result in arrest and prosecution. People in positions of legal or other jeopardy have proven especially vulnerable to recruitment as informers. 2. Deal openly with the form and content of what anyone says and does, whether the person is a suspected agent, has emotional problems, or is simply a sincere but naive or confused person new to the work. 3. Establish a process through which anyone who suspects an infiltrator can express his or her fears without scaring others. Experienced people assigned this responsibility can do a great deal to help a group maintain its morale and focus while, at the same time, consolidating information and deciding how to use it. This plan works best when accompanied by group discussion of the danger of paranoia, so that everyone understands the reasons for following the established procedure. 4. Take steps to alert other activists anytime an agent or informer admits their role or you have a concrete and verified basis for certain knowledge. Act immediately and use every available means, including photographs, aliases, identifying traits, and a description of methods of operation. In the 1960s, some agents managed, even after their exposure in one community, to move on and repeat their performance in others. 5. Be very cautious in attempting to expose a suspected, but unadmitted, agent or informer. The best approach depends on the nature of your group. A close-knit, self-selecting group of experienced activists, especially one which contemplates illegal activity, should exclude anyone who is not fully trusted by everyone involved. If the stakes are high, don't be afraid to trust your intuition. An open, public organization trying to reach out and involve new people faces a very different situation. Here, an attempted exposure carries enormous risks. The suspect may claim to be the victim of discrimination and may falsely finger his or her accusers as agents. In the process, activists may be turned against one another and lose the mutual trust and respect which is vital to any successful organization. New members and potential recruits may be scared away. The group's attention and energy may be so diverted that it is no longer able to move effectively toward its main goals. Activists who suspect infiltration of a public political organization should carefully evaluate alternatives to attempted exposure. The AP4's appropriate response depends on the kind of agent or informer you think you are dealing with. A suspect who seems to play a passive, or even a constructive role may secretly be undermining a group's work or passing information to the FBI and police. In this situation, it often is most productive to discreetly limit the suspect's opportunities without making your suspicions public. Take steps to deny access to organizational funds, financial records, mailing lists, office equipment, planning and security committees, discussions of illegal activity, and meetings that plan criminal defense strategy. Go public if I later catch the person in the act. A different approach is required if suspect is an active disruptor or provocateur. In this case, it is most constructive to confront the form and content of what the suspect says and does, without making an issue of why he or she says or does it. Start with a discreet private talk, since the suspect could be merely naive or misguided. If the harmful behavior persists, you probably will have to take it in an open group discussion. Plan in advance how to limit the risk of disruption and demoralization. If you need to exclude or expel the suspect, be sure to inform other activists of your decision and reasons. 2. Psychological warfare from the outside while boring from within. The FBI and police also attack dissident movements from the outside. They openly mount propaganda campaigns through public addresses, news releases, books, pamphlets, magazine articles, radio, and television. They also use covert deception and manipulation. Documented tactics of this kind include, false media stories. COINTELPRO documents expose frequent collusion between news media personnel and the FBI to publish false and distorted material at the Bureau's behest. The FBI routinely leaked derogatory information to its collaborators in the news media. It also created newspaper and magazine articles and television documentaries which the media knowingly or unknowingly carried as their own. Copies were sent anonymously or under bogus letterhead to activists' financial backers, employers, business associates, families, neighbors, church officials, school administrators, landlords, and whomever else might cause them trouble. 109. One FBI media fabrication claimed that Jean Seberg, a white film star active in anti-racist causes, was pregnant by a prominent black leader. The Bureau leaked the story anonymously to columnist Joyce 46. Haber and also had it passed to her by a friendly source in the Los Angeles Times editorial staff. The item appeared without attribution in Haber's nationally syndicated column of May 19, 1970. Seberg's husband has sued the FBI as responsible for her resulting stillbirth, nervous breakdown, and suicide. 110 bogus leaflets, pamphlets, and other publications. COINTELPRO documents show that the FBI routinely put out phony leaflets, posters, pamphlets, newspapers, and other publications in the name of movement groups. The purpose was to discredit the groups and turn them against one another. FBI cartoon leaflets were used to divide and disrupt the main national anti-war coalition of the late 1960s. Similar flyers were circulated in 1968 and 1969 in the name of the Black Panthers and the United Slaves, a rival black nationalist group based in Southern California. The phony Panther/US leaflets, together with other covert operations, were credited with subverting a fragile truce between the two groups and igniting an explosion of internecine violence that left 4 Panthers dead, many more wounded, and a once flourishing regional black movement decimated. Another major COINTELPRO operation involved a children's coloring book which the Black Panther Party had rejected as anti-white and gratuitously violent. The FBI revised the coloring book to make it even more offensive. Its field offices then distributed thousands of copies anonymously or under phony organizational letterheads. Many backers of the party's program of free breakfasts for children withdrew their support after the FBI conned them into believing that the bogus coloring book was being used in the program. 112 forged correspondence. Former employees have confirmed that the FBI has the capacity to produce state-of-the-art forgery. 113 This capacity was used under COINTELPRO to create snitch jackets and bogus communications that exacerbated differences among activists and disrupted their work. One such forgery intimidated civil rights worker Muhammad Kenyatta, causing him to abandon promising projects in Jackson, Mississippi. Kenyatta had foundation grants to form black economic cooperatives and open a black and proud school for dropouts. He was also a student organizer at nearby Tougaloo College. In the winter of 1969, after an extended campaign of FBI and police harassment, Kenyatta received a letter, purportedly from the Tougaloo College Defense Committee, which directed that he cease his political activities immediately. If he did not heed our diplomatic and well-thought-out warning, the committee would consider taking measures. A key 1960s covert operation that fueled antagonism between emerging tendencies among progressive women did not come to light until almost 20 years later. When women speakers at the National Counter-Inaugural Rally in 1969 raised issues of women's oppression, men in the audience had shouted them down and threatened sexual violence. Shaken by the incident, women activists met at the home of one of the speakers, Marilyn Webb, to analyze what had happened and decide whether to keep trying to work within the New Left. As they talked, the phone rang and a woman's voice threatened Webb. "If you or anybody else like you ever gives a speech like that again, we're going to beat the shit out of you." SDS has a line on women's liberation, and that is the line. The voice and content of the call made it appear to be from Kathy Wilkerson, a well-known SDS organizer who was in the same women's group as many of the women in the room. The women assumed that Wilkerson had, in fact, made the call, and the story spread across the country, provoking bitter anger. It was only at an SDS reunion in the summer of 1988, that Webb learned that neither Wilkerson nor any other SDS woman had made such a call. 114. Which would have a more direct effect and which would not be as cordial as this note. Kenyatta and his wife left. Only years later did they learn it was not Tougaloo students, but FBI covert operators who had driven them out. 115 Later in 1969, FBI agents fabricated a letter to the mainly white organizers of a proposed Washington, D.C. anti-war rally demanding that they pay the local black community a $20,000 security bond. This attempted extortion was composed in the name of the local Black United Front and signed with the forged signature of its leader. FBI informers inside the BUF then tried to get the group to back such a demand, and bureau contacts in the media made sure the story received wide publicity. 116 The Senate Intelligence Committee uncovered a series of FBI letters sent to top Panther leaders throughout 1970 in the name of Connie Matthews, an intermediary between the Black Panther Party's national office and Panther leader Eldridge Cleaver, in exile in Algeria. These exquisite forgeries were prepared on pilfered stationery in Panther vernacular expertly simulated by the FBI's Washington, D.C. laboratory. Each was forwarded to an FBI legal attaché at a U.S. embassy in a foreign country that Matthews was due to travel through and then posted at just the right time in such a manner that it cannot be traced to the bureau. The FBI enhanced the eerie authenticity of these fabrications by lacing them with esoteric personal tidbits culled from electronic surveillance of Panther homes and offices. Combined with other forgeries, anonymous letters and phone calls, and the covert intervention of FBI and police infiltrators, the Matthews correspondence succeeded in inflaming intra-party mistrust and rivalry until it erupted into the bitter public split that shattered the organization in the winter of 1971. 117 Anonymous letters and telephone calls. During the 1960s, activists received a steady flow of anonymous letters and phone calls which turned out to have been from the FBI. Some were unsigned, while others bore bogus names or purported to come from unidentified activists in phony or actual organizations. 118 Many of these bogus communications promoted racial divisions and fears, often by exploiting and exacerbating tensions between Jewish and black activists. One such FBI-concocted letter went to SOS members who had joined black students protesting New York University's discharge of a black teacher in 1969. The supposed author, an unnamed SOS member, urged whites to break ranks and abandon the black students because of alleged anti-Semitic slurs by the fired teacher and his supporters. 119 other anonymous letters and phone calls falsely accused movement leaders of collaboration with the authorities, corruption, or sexual affairs with other activists' mates. The letter on the next page was used to provoke a lasting distrust between a black civil rights leader and his wife. Its FBI authors hoped that his concern over what to do about it would detract from his time spent in the plots and plans of his organization 1211. As in the Seberg incident, interracial sex was a persistent theme. The husband of one white woman active in civil rights and anti-war work filed for divorce soon after receiving the FBI-authored letter reproduced on page 50. Still other anonymous FBI communications were designed to intimidate dissidents, disrupt coalitions, and provoke violence. Calls to Stokely Carmichael's mother warning of a fictitious Black Panther murder plot drove him to leave the country in September 1968. 121 similar anonymous FBI telephone threats to SNCC leader James Foreman were instrumental in thwarting efforts to bring the two groups together. 122 The Chicago FBI made effective use of anonymous letters to sabotage the Panthers' efforts to build alliances with previously apolitical black street gangs. The most extensive of these operations involved the Black P. Stone Nation, or Black Stone Rangers, a powerful confederation of several thousand local black youth. Early in 1969, as FBI and police infiltrators in the Rangers spread rumors of an impending Panther attack, the Bureau sent Ranger Chief Jeff Fort an incendiary note signed "A Black Brother You Don't Know." Fort's supposed friend warned that the brothers that run the Panthers blame you for blocking their thing and there's supposed to be a hit out for you one. Another FBI-concocted anonymous black man then informed Chicago Panther leader Fred Hampton of a Ranger plot to get you out of the way. These fabrications squelched promising talks between the two groups and enabled Chicago Panther Security Chief William O'Neill, an FBI-paid provocateur, to instigate a series of armed confrontations from which the Panthers barely managed to escape without serious casualties. 124 Pressure through employers, landlords, and others. FBI records reveal repeated maneuvers to generate pressure on dissidents from their parents, children, spouses, landlords, employers, college administrators, church superiors, welfare agencies, credit bureaus, and the like. Anonymous letters and telephone calls were often used to this end. Confidential official communications were effective in bringing to bear the Bureau's immense power and authority. 12's agents' reports indicate that such FBI intervention denied Martin Luther King, Jr., and other 1960s activists any number of foundation grants and public speaking engagements. 126 It also deprived alternative newspapers of their printers, suppliers, and distributors and cost them. So Brian Glick crucial advertising revenues when major record companies were persuaded to take their business elsewhere. 121 Similar government manipulation may underlie steps recently taken by some insurance companies to cancel policies held by churches giving sanctuary to refugees from El Salvador and Guatemala. Tampering with Mullen telephone service, the FBI and CIA routinely used mail covers and electronic surveillance in order to spy on 196OS movements. The CIA alone admitted to photographing the outside of 2.7 million pieces of first-class mail during the 196OS and to opening almost 215,000. Government agencies also tampered with mail, altering, delaying, or disappearing it. Activists were quick to blame one another, and infiltrators easily exploited the situation to exacerbate their tensions. 128. FBI anonymous letter to undermine a white woman activist's civil rights and anti-war work. 51. FBI fronts. COINTELPRO documents reveal that a number of 1960s political groups and projects were actually set up and operated by the FBL 129-1, Grupo Pro Uso Voto del MPIN was used to disrupt the fragile unity developing in the mid-1960s among the MPI and other groups seeking Puerto Rico's independence from the United States. The genuine proponents of independence had joined together around a common strategy of boycotting colonial elections which the U.S. government manipulated to legitimize continued U.S. rule. The bogus group, pretending to support independence, urged independentistas to ignore the boycott and go to the polls. 130 Since FBI front groups are basically a means for penetrating and disrupting dissident movements, it is best to deal with them on the basis of the guidelines for coping with infiltration. Confront what a suspect group says and does, but avoid public accusations unless you have definite proof. If you do have such proof, share it with everyone affected. Dissidents' telephone communications often were similarly obstructed. The SOS regional office in Washington, D.C., for instance, mysteriously lost its phone service the week preceding virtually every national anti-war demonstration in the late 196 OS. 1 foot 1 inch disinformation to prevent or disrupt movement meetings and activities. A favorite COINTELPRO tactic uncovered by Senate investigators was to advertise a non-existent political event, or to misinform people of the time and place of an actual one. They reported a variety of disruptive FBI dirty tricks designed to cast blame on the organizers of movement events. In one disinformation case, the Chicago field office duplicated blank forms prepared by the National Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam soliciting housing for demonstrators at the Democratic National Convention. Chicago filled out 217 of these forms with fictitious names and addresses and sent them to the NMC, which provided them to demonstrators who made long and useless journeys to locate these addresses. And the NMC then decided to discard all replies received on the housing forms rather than have out-of-town demonstrators try to locate non-existent addresses. In another case, during the demonstrations accompanying inauguration ceremonies, the Washington field office discovered that NMC marshals were using walkie-talkies to coordinate their movements and activities. WFO used the same citizen band to supply the marshals with misinformation and, pretending to be an NMC unit, countermanded NMC orders. In a third case, A and his followers are associating with, and using the facilities of, the Workers' World Party. The WWP is a splinter group of the Socialist Workers' Party and are known as Marxists. In an instance such as this, it is felt that an opportunity is presented whereby mimeographed flyers could be directed to various individuals of the different pro-independence groups pointing out the intrusion of the WWP and worded in such a way as to indicate that the SWP was the originator of the flyer. The above items are submitted as suggestions as a beginning. They in no way cover the vast field of possibilities in the counterintelligence program, as numerous instances will undoubtedly arise from time to time whereby new ideas can be formulated which can further promote such a program. War at Home 77. SAC, Albany, August 25, 1967. Personal attention to all offices. Director, FBI. Counterintelligence Program. Black Nationalist, Hate Groups. Internal Security. The purpose of this new counterintelligence endeavor is to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize the activities of black nationalist hate-type organizations and groupings, their leadership, spokesmen, membership, and supporters, and to counter their propensity for violence and civil disorder. The activities of all such groups of intelligence interest to the Bureau must be followed on a continuous basis, so we will be in a position to promptly take advantage of all opportunities for counterintelligence and to inspire action in instances where circumstances warrant. The pernicious background of such groups, their duplicity and devious maneuvers must be exposed to public scrutiny where such publicity will have a neutralizing effect. Efforts of the various groups to consolidate their forces or to recruit new or youthful adherents must be frustrated. No opportunity should be missed to exploit through counterintelligence techniques the organizational and personal conflicts of the leaderships of the groups, and where possible an effort should be made to capitalize upon existing conflicts between competing black nationalist organizations. When an opportunity is apparent to disrupt or neutralize black nationalist, hate-type organizations through the cooperation of established local news media contacts or through such contact with sources available to the seat of government, in every instance careful attention must be given to the proposal to ensure the targeted group is disrupted, ridiculed, or discredited through the publicity and not merely publicized. You are also cautioned that the nature of this new endeavor is such that under no circumstances should the existence of the program be made known outside the Bureau, and appropriate within-office security should be afforded to sensitive operations and techniques considered under the program. No counterintelligence action under this program may be initiated by the field without specific prior Bureau authorization. Counterintelligence Program. Black Nationalist, Hate Groups. Racial Intelligence. Background: March 4, '68. The Revolutionary Action Movement, a pro-Chinese communist group, was active in Philadelphia, PA, in the summer of 1967. The Philadelphia office alerted local police, who then put RAM leaders under close scrutiny. They were arrested on every possible charge until they could no longer make bail. As a result, RAM leaders spent most of the summer in jail and no violence traceable to RAM took place. For maximum effectiveness of the counterintelligence program, and to prevent wasted effort, long-range goals are being set. 1. Prevent the coalition of militant black nationalist groups. In unity there is strength, a truism that is no less valid for all its triteness. An effective coalition of black nationalist groups might be the first step toward a real Mau Mau in America, the beginning of a true black revolution. 2. Prevent the rise of a messiah who could unify, and electrify, the militant black nationalist movement. Malcolm X might have been such a messiah. He is the martyr of the movement today. Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael, and Elijah Muhammad all aspire to this position. Elijah Muhammad is less of a threat because of his age. King could be a very real contender for this position should he abandon his supposed obedience to white, liberal doctrines and embrace black nationalism. Carmichael has the necessary charisma to be a real threat in this way. 3. Prevent violence on the part of black nationalist groups. This is of primary importance, and is, of course, a goal of our investigative activity. It should also be a goal of the counterintelligence program. Through counterintelligence it should be possible to pinpoint potential troublemakers and neutralize them before they exercise their potential for violence. 4. Prevent militant black nationalist groups and leaders from gaining respectability, by discrediting them to 3 separate segments of the community. The goal of discrediting black nationalists must be 79. Handled tactically in 3 ways. You must discredit those groups and individuals to, first, the responsible Negro community. Second, they must be discredited to the white community, both the responsible community and to liberals who have vestiges of sympathy for militant black nationalists simply because they are Negroes. Third, these groups must be discredited in the eyes of Negro radicals, the followers of the movement. This last area requires entirely different tactics from the first 2. Publicity about violent tendencies and radical statements merely enhances black nationalists to the last group, it adds respectability in a different way. 5. A final goal should be to prevent the long-range growth of militant black nationalist organizations, especially among youth. Specific tactics to prevent these groups from converting young people must be developed. Primary targets of the counterintelligence program, black nationalist hate groups, should be the most violent and radical groups and their leaders. We should emphasize those leaders and organizations that are nationwide in scope and are most capable of disrupting this country. These targets should include the radical and violence-prone leaders, members, and followers of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Revolutionary Action Movement, Nation of Islam offices handling these cases, and those of Stokely Carmichael of SNCC, H. Rap Brown of SNCC, Martin Luther King of SCLC, Maxwell Stanford of RAM, and Elijah Muhammad of NOI, should be alert for counterintelligence suggestions. Counterintelligence Program. Internal Security. Disruption of the New Left July 5, 68 Bullet May 10, 68 requested suggestions for counterintelligence action against the New Left. The replies to the Bureau's request have been analyzed, and it is felt that the following suggestions for counterintelligence action can be utilized by all offices. 1. Preparation of a leaflet designed to counteract the impression that Students for a Democratic Society and other minority groups speak for the majority of students at universities. The leaflet should contain photographs of New Left leadership at the respective university. Naturally, the most obnoxious pictures should be used. 2. The instigating of or the taking advantage of personal conflicts or animosities existing between New Left leaders. 3. The creating of impressions that certain New Left leaders are informants for the Bureau or other law enforcement agencies. 4. The use of articles from student newspapers and or the underground press to show the depravity of New Left leaders and members. In this connection, articles showing advocation of the use of narcotics and free sex are ideal to send to university officials, wealthy donors, members of the legislature and parents of students who are active in New Left matters. 5. Since the use of marijuana and other narcotics is widespread among members of the New Left, you should be alert to opportunities to have them arrested by local authorities on drug charges. 6. The drawing up of anonymous letters regarding individuals active in the New Left. These letters should set out their activities and should be sent to their parents, neighbors, and the parents' employers. This could have the effect of forcing the parents to take action. 7. Anonymous letters or leaflets describing faculty members and graduate assistants in the various institutions of higher learning who are active in New Left matters. The activities and associations of the individual should be set out. Anonymous mailings should be made to university officials, members of the state. 81. Legislature, Board of Regents, and to the press. Such letters could be signed a concerned alumni or a concerned taxpayer. 8. Whenever New Left groups engage in disruptive activities on college campuses, cooperative press contacts should be encouraged to emphasize that the disruptive elements constitute a minority of the students and do not represent the conviction of the majority. 9. There is a definite hostility among SOS and other New Left groups toward the Socialist Workers' Party, the Young Socialist Alliance, and the Progressive Labor Party. This hostility should be exploited wherever possible. 10. The field was previously advised that New Left groups are attempting to open coffee houses near military bases in order to influence members of the armed forces. Wherever these coffee houses are, friendly news media should be alerted to them and their purpose. In addition, various drugs, such as marijuana, will probably be utilized by individuals running the coffee houses or frequenting them. Local law enforcement authorities should be promptly advised whenever you receive an indication that this is being done. 11. Consider the use of cartoons, photographs, and anonymous letters which will have the effect of ridiculing the New Left. Ridicule is one of the most potent weapons which we can use against it. 12. Be alert for opportunities to confuse and disrupt New Left activities by misinformation. For example, when events are planned, notification that the event has been cancelled or postponed could be sent to various individuals.